Hey folks, today we are going to talk about two separate, like kind of related features. So one of the features is the ability for DBT to check whether a source is fresh or not and to emit an error or a warning, depending on how you've configured it. Second, there's this source status fresher selector method, right? This can kind of trip people up. Sometimes they think that these two things are related in a way. And I would say they kind of are related, but they are independent and separate features, right? So this is kind of how I would describe it. When you are doing a source freshness check, this feature is totally self-contained, right? What I mean by self-contained is that there is no need for the source freshness checking feature to compare to another sources.json file. Okay, so how this works is we get the current time, we look at the source and see when it was updated, and then we just do some math, right? Take 2 minus 1, and if let's say you configure a 12-hour error, then if 2 minus 1 is bigger than 12, then we error. Okay, that's how source freshness checking works. It is totally self-contained within the current run itself. Now, the selector method of source status fresher, this is a little bit more complicated. It basically needs to compare to another sources JSON, right? So you will have a sources JSON from the current run, a sources JSON from a previous run, and then DBT is going to look into them and DBT is going to compare, right? If the current run has, for the source, if the updated timestamp is bigger than what it was previously, then we say the source is source status fresher and therefore build the models that are selecting from that source. Now, I'm going to explain all of this using DBT Core, and then we can move on to DBT Cloud and kind of do the same thing. So let's have a look. So here I've got a pretty simple DBT project. I've got a customer source and an orders source, and then I'm going to have a stage customers selecting from customers and stage orders selecting from orders, right? So this is all pretty straightforward stuff. Now, I'm going to go into Snowflake and I am going to create the sources. And you can see here, I've set my timestamp to be, somewhere at the start of the, human life, right? 1970, 0101. Okay, so now that I've got this source set up, what we're going to do here is we're going to run a source freshness check. And then we're going to look at the output. Okay, so this stuff says stale, right? Which is pretty straightforward because I said we want to error if the timestamp of the updated ad is more than 12 hours, right? So if we do a debug run, just to kind of look at the commands, we can see what DBT is doing, right? So for the customer source, we select the max updated ad, which is 1970 or 101, get the current timestamp, and then we do some math, right? So this one minus this one is more than 12 hours. And of course, I told DBT, please error. So DBT has errored accordingly. Okay, so that is source freshness itself. Now, what you will see is when we run source freshness, we actually wrote a sources JSON file to the target directory, right? So I'm going to remove that just so you can see it again. Okay, so I got rid of the target folder. Run it again. Okay, and then you can see here, target has been written to this. We plot this in here. And then if we look at the contents, we see the max loaded at, right? Which is the 1970-01-01 timestamp right from here for both of the sources. So this one has max loaded at 1970-01-01, max loaded at 1970-01-01. Okay, so let's go and um, let's say we modify this to be current timestamp. Or yeah, current timestamp. Okay. So here I'm only going to modify customers. I'm going to leave orders alone. And then let's do our source freshness check again. And now we see the past, right? This again, pretty straightforward. Let's go and look at our sources.json file. And here we see the customer's max loaded is 918, which is the current timestamp here. And of course, if we go back to our good old orders, we see 1970-0101, which is why we get a stale error here. Cool. Now that is sources itself, source freshness, which I explained. So get the current time. What is the time the source was updated? Do some math, error, warn or not, right? So that's what source freshness checking is. Now, what exactly is this selector method source status fresher thing all about, right? So we can tell dbt if the last time you check the source was a timestamp of A, like here, right? So if the last time you checked the updated of a source was A, and if you check the timestamp of the source again now, compare them, and is one bigger than the other or not? If it is, then it should be fresher, right? So this we can do this with dbt as well. So first I'm going to show you what happens if I just build like so. So you can see here, dbt is saying, hey, there is no previous state comparison freshness result in sources.json, right? So what is this exactly? This is telling you with a single sources.json alone, right? So here you can see we have just a single sources.json. dbt cannot perform this operation, right? dbt cannot perform this source status fresher plus stuff. So what we need to do, this is pretty similar to using state modified, if you're familiar with that. So what we need to do is we need to, as I said, we need to give dbt two different sources JSON, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to move my target directory to target O. So I basically made a copy of the old sources JSON. And now I'm going to generate another sources JSON because, like I said, we need two sources.json files. So generate another one. And of course, this goes into target. And then the sources will be written out. And it's error stale. One's error stale, one is passing. And you can see in the target here, we have sources JSON. Okay, so now the prerequisites are fulfilled. We have two different sources.json. Let's run source status fresher. And with dbt core, we have to point and tell dbt, hey, please look at this other directory for the other sources JSON, right? So this is what I'm doing here exactly. And let's see what happens. Okay, so here dbt says there is nothing to do. Now let's see why there is nothing to do, right? So I'm going to pull this sources JSON. Okay, this sources JSON is from the first time we ran source freshness, and this is the new one that we just generated. Okay, so if we compare them, obviously they're going to be the same, right? So dbt is going to, when we run source as fresher, dbt is going to analyze the two sources JSONs, right? So here, what do we see? We see the max loaded at for customers is 9/18/05/54/39. And on this side, we also see 9/18/5/40/54/39. So on this side, both of this is exactly the same. Because they are exactly the same, then we see one is not bigger than two, so the source is not fresher, okay? Because they have the same updated timestamp, as we can see here. Now, if we go to the next source, is basically the same thing. Here we also see, obviously, the max loaded at 1970-0101, 1970-0101. So because of that, there is nothing to do here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to increment the timestamp and let's see what happens, right? So first I'm going to make a copy. To make a copy of the timestamp. So let's just go ahead and copy this. Obviously, this is in my Snowflake local time, but I'm going to recreate it, which would have incremented the timestamp, right? So previously it was 22:54:39, and now it's 22:59:49, right? So this timestamp is bigger than what it was before. So what can we do here? Now, because this has been incremented, we need to generate a new sources JSON. So as we know, to get a new sources JSON, we need to run dbt source freshness, right? Okay, this old stuff is still erroring and stale, which makes perfect sense because we have not updated this since I started talking. And if I look at the sources JSON now for the new invocation, now we see 5:59:49, which is bigger than 54:39, right? So guess what happens when I do dbt build, fresher, and compare to this other old one, right? And now we have stage customers building because the raw customer source is fresher, right? Let's go ahead and do a comparison again. So we got this one from the very first time we did that, and we got this new sources JSON. So what do we see here? 5:59:49, and this is 5:54:39, right? So go back to what I said before. Current runs time of the source is 5:59:49. Previous run of the source 5:54:39. So 1 is bigger than 2. So the source of customers is fresh. Therefore, we will build fresher plus will be stage customers, right? So that is how source status fresher works, right? You need two sources, right? If you have just one, like I said before, if you have just one and you're not pointing to another sources.json, then DB is going to complain, right? Hey, I need to compare the sources JSON from what I have right now to something else before, right? So that's why we do this differ state stuff. Cool. So I'm going to go and reset all of this, and then let's try and do it in dbt Cloud itself. Okay, so first I'm going to run that. Cool. So I've reset the customer source back to how it was. And then here in dbt Cloud, I have a job. And my job is pretty straightforward now. I am going to just run source freshness. Okay. And then let's run the job, so that we can kind of look at the output, right? I want to show you that is basically exactly the same thing that is happening here. So we should get 2 error stales, right? Both sources should be stale. And let's see when that happens. Okay, so here we see the stale errors just like we did over here. Okay, cool. Now let's go ahead and modify our job. In this case, I'm going to use, when we use this checkbox option instead of running dbt source freshness here, what will happen is that even though here we get a stale, dbt is going to allow us to proceed to the next command, right? If you don't use this checkbox, then when source freshness errors, dbt is going to skip all of your commands down here. So it depends on what you want, right? Do you want dbt to continue running commands? Then you want to use this checkbox. If you want dbt to error whenever source is not fresh at all, then don't use this checkbox and put source freshness in here. right? So you have plenty of options there. So I'm going to copy this command. And now the folks from who is familiar with DBT Cloud, they know that defer state, this is not flags you need to use in DBT Cloud, right? DBT Cloud already automatically does that for you. And how you do that is you say compare against the environment, right? Now, some folks say, some folks who just freshly discover this command, they might think, hey, I don't need any deferral, right? I don't need to point to another state. So let's see what happens if you do that. So source freshness is going to run the first thing, and then we are going to go to this next command. So let's see what happens. So again, source freshness is running. And here we get our stale errors, I believe. Let's see. Okay. And then go to the next one. So you can see here again, this no previous state comparison freshness in SourceJS. Now you are familiar with that because I have described to you exactly why this happens, right? If you are using this command and you are not pointing to another sources JSON, then DBT is going to error and say, hey, no previous state comparison to do, right? So how can we fix this? This is pretty straightforward. Go into our job, go to our settings, and then here we want to make sure we defer, as in compare to another environment or compare to this job itself or kind of what have you, right? So I'm going to do that. I'm going to save, and let's see what happens when I run again. So when I'm running here, you'll notice immediately that this one says this run deferred to 42996069, right? Which is some kind of old run over here, which is not what we want, because that run, the run itself didn't generate any source freshness for us. So let me, okay. Yeah, so this run deferred to this other run here. This run, obviously, we didn't run any source freshness, so that's why we didn't get that. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to bootstrap my sources JSON by modifying my job first. Let me do a compile. Okay, I just want to make sure the job is passing first to get a success, because DBT won't defer to any job that has error, right? So what I'm trying to do here is get a job that did not fail so that DBT will defer to that job, that run. Okay. So we know source, see, this is the behavior I was telling you about in terms of the checkbox method. So the checkbox method, even though this fails, it allows us to go to the next step, which I've asked DBT to run a compile. Should be a success. Okay, great. So this build itself has source freshness and it has compile, which means there is a sources JSON. You can see over here. Great. And then I can go and modify my job to S plus source status fresh plus. Yeah. Cool. Now let's go ahead and run our job again. So here, the current, if we look at my board again, the current run is running source freshness to create its own sources JSON. And this run has deferred to run 42 something or other, which we see over here. So this run here has deferred to this run here, right? So this run has its own sources JSON. This run has its own sources JSON. Therefore, we can use this command. But again, obviously, this command says nothing to do because the sources JSON on the left side and the right side line up exactly, right? So if we download this sources JSON, let's check in here. Let's have a look. So sources JSON here, 1970-0101, 1970-0101 for this other one as well. And if we look in the run, which actually used that selector, so it's fresher, I think comes to no surprise that this is also 1970-0101, 1970-0101. So because both of this have the same timestamps for both sources, then there is nothing to do, right? Because there is no source that is actually fresher. So what can we do about it? Obviously, once our source gets updated, I mean, we can even make this too, right? So, okay. So I've incremented the timestamp of our source. So when dbt runs a source freshness check next on this, it's going to see that, it's going to change this timestamp from 0101 to 0102. So let's go ahead and build our daily job again. Now, this run is going to differ to the very previous run, 388 here. And this is the sources from 388. This 1970-0101 is going to become 1970-0102, which means customers source is fresh, therefore bill stage customers, right? That's my expectation. Let's see what happens. Hey, and lo and behold, stage customers is built because if we look at the sources JSON for this particular run, we can see here 1970-0102 versus 1970-0101. So this is fresher, means bill customers, stage customers, right? Any model that's selecting from this source. So to recap, this is the difference, right? So you can see here, like just this source freshness step, right? The checking of the freshness has nothing to do with whatever this next step is, right? So you can check the status of your freshness, which you have to anyway, because you need to generate a sources JSON. And when you next run source status fresher plus, it's going to take the sources JSON from this run and compare to the sources JSON from this run. And dbt is going to do what I said here. Current runs, time of the source being updated, previous run of the source being updated. If one is bigger than two, for example, 1970-0102 is bigger than 1970-0101, then this source is fresher. Therefore, fresher plus means build anything that is selecting from a fresher source, right? So you can see they are kind of related, but at the end of the day, they are different feature sets of dbt. Hope that helps clarify somewhat. Thank you.